Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Something I think we've all thought about at one time or another is how suffering and faith kind of relate to each other, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're looking at this article today called, what's it called? What the Bible teaches us about suffering.
Okay.
And it's pretty interesting. It's a sensitive topic for a lot of people,
For sure.
but there's definitely some thought-provoking stuff in here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So right off the bat, the article shares a couple of personal stories, and
Uh,
these were really powerful. Talking about Lucia and Damaris,
mm.
both of them carried this belief that they were like being punished by God through their suffering.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Lucia got polio as a kid and was told her paralysis was a direct result of her being disobedient.
Oh, that's awful.
And Damaris, her own father, told her that her brain cancer, it must be divine retribution for some sin she committed.
It's just heartbreaking to think about dealing with serious health issues on top of that kind of guilt and blame.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, is that really how God works? Does he use sickness as a way to punish people?
It's a question people have wrestled with forever.
It is. And this idea that illness stems from sin, it's got a long history. We see it in ancient cultures all the way through the Middle Ages. You know, those books we've talked about before,
Yeah.
Manners and Customs of Bible Lands and Medieval Medicine and the Plague.
Yeah.
Both of them show how widespread that belief was, especially, during times when there was a lot of disease and suffering going around.
Right. When something bad happened, people wanted an explanation.
Exactly.
But if God is supposed to be all loving and merciful, how does that fit?
That's where the article takes a really interesting turn. It challenges this whole idea, and it has a section called What the Bible Teaches Us About Suffering.
Okay.
And it focuses on Jesus' healing ministry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if God was punishing people through sickness, why would Jesus go around healing everybody?
That's a good point. It does seem to go against the idea of suffering as punishment, with Jesus showing compassion and wanting to relieve people's pain.
Right, and he even said straight up that suffering isn't always a direct result of sin. There's that powerful story in John 9.1, try 3 about the man born blind. Remember,
right.
his disciples asked Jesus who sinned to cause the blindness, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And Jesus said it wasn't about sin at all. It was an opportunity for God's power to be seen.
That's such a different way of looking at it. So it's not that someone did something wrong and they're being punished.
Exactly. It offers so much comfort to people who are dealing with health problems. You're not being singled out or punished by God.
I can see how that would be reassuring.
Yeah, and the article really emphasizes God's justice and righteousness, and how suffering isn't always divine retribution for every sin.
I see.
It even gives examples from the Bible, like Deuteronomy 32.4, which clearly states that Jehovah God is never unjust. And in Genesis 18:23 and 25, Abraham is arguing that God would never destroy good people alongside the wicked. He actually uses the word unthinkable to describe it.
Wow. So even in the Old Testament, there's this idea that God's justice isn't about immediately punishing every single sin with suffering.
Exactly. And Job 34.0 to 12 says that God does not act wickedly. He doesn't do wrong.
Interesting.
And then to make it even more clear, the article uses this analogy like God wouldn't cause a plane crash just to punish one person.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like saying God's actions are guided by something much bigger than us.
Yeah. So we've kind of busted the myth that God punishes us directly with suffering, but that leaves a big question. If it's not God, then who or what is responsible for all the suffering?
That is the question, isn't it?
And we'll pick that up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we're back, and we're picking up on this question of suffering.
Yeah, if it's not God punishing us directly, then what's going on?
Exactly. In part 1, we busted that myth, but then who or what is responsible for all the suffering in the world?
That's the big question. And the article tackles it head on in the last section called Who is to Blame? It's complicated. It doesn't really give easy answers. I mean, this has been puzzling people for centuries.
Right.
But it does have some really interesting points.
Okay. Like what?
Well, one of the main things is that suffering isn't always about blame.
Really?
Yeah, it's not always about pointing a finger or finding one person who's responsible.
But-
Sometimes it's just part of living in such a complicated world.
Okay, so how can there be suffering with no one to blame?
Well, think about natural disasters like earthquakes and floods. Those things cause a ton of suffering, but it's not like someone is making them happen on purpose. It's just nature, right?
Right, yeah.
Forces of nature.
We can't control the weather or the earth, no matter how hard we try.
Nope.
But what about when people cause suffering? Then there's definitely blame,
Yeah.
right?
Of course. I mean, think about history, wars, violence, oppression, greed. All those things lead to terrible suffering because of human choices.
Like capable of awful things.
Yeah. But even when people cause suffering, it's not always like good versus evil or one bad guy. The article kind of hints that sometimes it's the systems we make, like the institutions that shape how we live.
So not just bad choices, but entire societies contributing to suffering.
Yes, exactly. Think about poverty, not having health care, discrimination. Those are types of suffering that happen because of how society works. Power and injustice, historical stuff too. It's not always one bad person, but how the system is set up.
This is getting complex. We've gone from God punishing us to forces of nature, individual choices, now whole society.
I know. It's like we're seeing the bigger picture. That's what makes this article so interesting. It's not giving us all the answers or telling us who's to blame.
It's like the article saying, figure it out.
Right. It just gives us a new way to think about suffering and then makes us figure out what we believe.
So where do we go from here?
Okay, so this article was mostly about the Bible, but there are other ways to look at this question of suffering.
Okay.
So next we're going to look at what philosophy and science say. More secular viewpoints.
That sounds interesting. It'll be cool to see how those ideas compare to what we've already learned. All right, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into suffering. We started by tossing out the idea that God's directly punishing us with sickness.
Right.
Then we talked about how natural disasters, human choices, even whole societies can play a part. It's been a wild ride.
It really has. And as we said, now we're going to switch gears a bit. We've been mainly looking at the Bible, but now we're going to bring in some secular stuff.
Okay.
Philosophy and science, what they have to say.
Curious to see what they add to all this. So does
Yeah.
this source answer the big WHY, like WHY do we suffer?
Well, it doesn't say it has all the answers, but it gives us a pretty interesting way to think about suffering's like role in being human.
Okay.
One of the big things is that suffering is just inevitable. It's part of life, period.
That sounds kind of depressing.
Yeah.
But I guess if you think about it, it's true. Even in nature, there's always hardship, right?
Right, yeah. Plants get messed up, animals get eaten, whole ecosystems go through crazy stuff.
Exactly. So this source is saying instead of thinking of suffering as only bad, like a sign something's wrong,
Yeah.
maybe it's just how things are.
Yeah, kind of like, we got to accept it's fundamental to life.
But WHY? What good is suffering? What's the point?
Well, think of it this way. Sometimes tough times make you grow stronger. Like in nature, forest fire seems bad, but then new stuff grows.
Right.
Muscle gets torn to get bigger. Maybe when we face tough stuff, it makes us tougher too, more able to deal with things.
Like what doesn't kill you?
Right, exactly. But what about the emotional, spiritual side of suffering, right? It's one thing to talk about physical stuff, but what about loss, grief, all that?
Yeah, that's the hard part.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This source says suffering can actually make us more caring.
Caring.
Yeah, empathetic, When we hurt, we get other people's pain better.
Makes sense. Got to walk in someone's shoes, right?
Exactly. And even scientifically, this source talks about how our brains are built to feel pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's survival. Pain's like an alarm, tells us to avoid danger. Without it, we'd be messing ourselves up constantly.
So it's like our body's way of protecting us.
Exactly. It might not feel good, but it's got a job to do. And maybe, this source says, maybe some emotional pain works the same way.
Oh, interesting.
Like it warns us about bad relationships, unhealthy stuff we do, beliefs that hold us back, that kind of thing.
That's a different way to look at it. Not why me, but
Yeah.
what's this teaching me?
Yes. And that brings us back to blame. This source is saying, yeah, hold people accountable, but maybe it's not always about finding someone to blame.
Okay.
Maybe sometimes suffering is more about how it changes us, what we learn, even connecting us to others.
Wow, we've covered a lot. From the Bible to nature, human choices, even how our brains work.
I know, right? It's cool how it all ties together, gives us a way deeper understanding than just one viewpoint.
Yeah, it's like so much bigger than we thought at first.
It is, and it's a conversation that shouldn't end here, This deep dive was just the start. We got to keep thinking about it, finding our own WN answers.
Exactly. And that's the end of another deep dive, folks. Hope you enjoyed exploring this topic with us. Keep thinking, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.